right. Hello, everyone. I am just checking out the list, seeing who's here. I appreciate everybody joining me. I haven't done a non-Zoom interface in a long time, so it's very strange to really be able to see absolutely no one. Usually you can count on someone turning their camera on. And as you can see, the rest of the PSU staff on the webinar have turned their cameras off. So I can't even see their faces. So I'm just going to assume that you're going to laugh at my jokes and smile, even if they are not particularly funny or good. Like I said, I appreciate y'all being here today. This is an event that is part of, oh my goodness, I can see chats. Casey chatted me. That is great. Um, I appreciate this is an event that is part of Research Week at PSU, which is a week that has been set up to celebrate the research activities of the campus, many of which involve lots of faculty and staff and students from around the campus. So I wanted to take today as a chance to just talk a little bit about some, basics of homelessness and housing, and really try to start to set the stage for this question. Um, Dr. Bates is making me laugh because, as you might be able to tell, I did not blur the screen because I thought we could be a little more informal, and that is definitely a nursery behind you. And so maybe the baby will appear to say hello. I have a new son, a 3-month-old baby boy, assigned male at birth, baby boy. So I'm really hoping that one of the things that I really feel like we're struggling with on the West Coast, also around the country, and particularly here in Portland, is a conversation about how do we plan for and bring online affordable housing and requisite services, while also holding in our hearts and moving forward on compassionate care for people who are currently experiencing homelessness. And so these conversations are not the same. And yet I think that when we start talking about homelessness, we conflate the two of them quite a bit, particularly in the media, in the general public, and amongst our elected officials. I hope there aren't any elected officials here today. I love them all. All right, so what does homelessness mean? There's actually a lot of definitions for homelessness. At HRAC, we use a pretty simple definition, and just to ensure y'all know what I'm talking about, HRAC is the Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative that I direct at PSU. It is a university level research center that is dedicated to looking at the intersectional issues that perpetuate and create homelessness. So we take a very broad definition of what homelessness is, and that is simply that is you do not have access to regular access to safe, adequate, and stable housing. We don't care if you are only sleeping in a tent. We do care if you were only sleeping in a tent, but if you sleep in a tent and you're living outside, if you are unsafely doubling up with a family member, for instance, violating a lease or creating overcrowded conditions, to us, those are all types of homelessness. And we are here to address all of those types of homelessness and work on ways to actually resolve them. Now, some of the things that you will hear about homelessness when you're describing homelessness is this question of sleeping in location. So is somebody unsheltered? Is somebody sheltered? So someone might be unsheltered if they are sleeping in a car or an RV or a tent or just sleeping on the sidewalk. Someone might be experiencing homelessness and sheltered if they're in an emergency shelter, or in what is called transitional housing, or are living what we do describe as doubled or tripled up. There's also a question about how long you've been homeless. And so you might hear people talk about episodic or recurrent homelessness. And these are all referring to temporal definitions of what constitute what kinds of homelessness. We've also got questions about frequency of homelessness, right? Was this a one-time short period of time in which someone experienced homelessness in their life and it was resolved quickly? Or is this something that is happening frequently across somebody's lifetime? And then lastly, we talk about homelessness in the context of different demographic groups. And so we're thinking about, you'll hear people talk about ending veterans homelessness or addressing homelessness amongst women escaping domestic violence. And you'll hear a lot about in Portland racial equity and the disproportionate burden that people of color face when experiencing homelessness. You'll also hear a lot about health, right? So people who are living with mental illness, and when mental illness also includes managing substance use disorders. And those are all part of these different demographic profiles that people bring when we're thinking about how to solve and prevent homelessness. Now, why do all of these different definitions matter? Well, they matter because it's how we decide how many people are experiencing homelessness in our region. Um, this is the only really boring, tedious table I'll make you look at, and I deliberately did not clean it up because the point is that this is really complicated and really messy. And so depending on which data sources you're using, you could have an estimate that varies quite dramatically. And so we can see here that this column, 2017 unsheltered PIT times annual extrapolation factor count, gives us 5,200 people for the Tri-County area. That number is essentially a rough estimate of how many people slept in tents or in cars across 2017 in the 3 counties, so roughly 5,300. But if you go over to the far column, bottom number, you'll see a total estimate of homeless populations, including 38,000 people, right? And so these are magnitudes of differences in numbers. And, from our perspective, we want to be planning to accommodate and support the most number of people who are experiencing homelessness. In public discourse, we often end up very much stuck on this 5,200 focus, and in terms of how we talk about and think about homelessness, and don't realize that the scale and scope and number of people experiencing homelessness is just so much larger. Why does this really come into play, and where does it come into play? 38,000 people experiencing homelessness in 2017. We estimated that over 10 years, it would take 10.6 to $4.1 billion to support them and to help them exit homelessness and then maintain stability in housing, if that is what they chose to do. And so, if you're thinking of that as only 5,000 people, that becomes a much lower number. All right. So what are some of the drivers of homelessness? Well, you're going to, I got distracted by the chat. The chat's not actually for me all the time, so I can just let it go. When we're thinking about drivers for people experiencing homelessness, of homelessness, we're really talking about massive systemic issues. And so when we think about some of the things that people will check the box on, it's things like criminal justice system, both in creating and perpetuating homelessness, healthcare, lack of access to healthcare, the economy, education, and housing. And when we think about these systems, if they were working correctly or actually designed for real people, they would move forward, and ideally, they wouldn't be conditioned on class, race, or gender, and they would produce well-being for everyone. Well, we of course know that no matter what happens, they're still conditioned by class, race, and gender, and well-being won't be achieved by everyone, but can be achieved by some families. Right now, and individuals, right now what we're seeing is that our pipes are leaking, and the pipes are leaking down and creating a bucket that is on the cusp of overflowing and creating homelessness. And we have put housing and the economy as the two biggest drivers of homelessness. And I want to be clear, I don't mean the economy in terms of like how much somebody makes at a job, although that's part of it, but the general idea that capitalism and the way in which housing is brought up into capitalism create the context of homelessness. All right, decided to work now. So yeah, I think it's really important that we keep in mind these disparities that do create the population that we see experiencing homelessness. And I always focus, and I think it's really important that we focus as a community on racial equity. Why do we focus on racial equity? Well, first and foremost, it is and has been demonstrated to be the hardest thing for us to talk about as people, right? You can put people together and they will, trudge forward on talking about gender inequity, health inequity, class inequity, and so forth. But man, you say we're going to talk about racial equity, and that can totally tilt the conversation. One of the things that I think is pretty interesting is that even in a conversation about racial equity, and I see it here in class with my students, is that I will see people shift to talking about immigrants and really work hard to not talk about people who are multi-generationally in this country or who were from this country before it was the United States, and or even just descendants of recent immigrants or people who are recent immigrants. And so really trying to say, no, we actually have to have this really hard conversation first, then sets the stage for us to be able to have all these other conversations, and that we don't lose sight of racial equity that way. The other thing that we know is that when we look at any of the other groups that are experiencing some kind of inequity, some kind of oppression or marginalization, people of color tend to fare the worst within those groups. And so we know, again, if we are starting with a conversation about Black women, we are in fact going to be talking about white women, right? Because we're talking about women and we're talking about Black women in particular. We can center on the needs, experiences, and perspectives of Black women, and know that what we design will also be able to help and support other people. All right, let's talk about housing. My minion's very exciting. I'm not going to get really deep into housing. I did see that Dr. Bates was here, and I don't know why she revealed herself, because now I can call on her to ask any really hard housing questions. I do think it's important to keep some things in mind when talking about homelessness and housing, because the solution to homelessness is housing. Right? We know that no matter what all of these other drivers are, the systems that are set up, fundamentally, homelessness is solved by providing housing to people. Um, when we're thinking about housing, we were going to run immediately into urban planning. I'm an urban planner, a land use planner, and so this is an area where I feel very comfortable saying how much we have failed as a profession. So we have never considered housing to be a true infrastructure of our city, despite it being the overwhelming majority of our land use in an area. We don't plan for it in the same way that we plan for, say, roads or sewers. We also have used zoning code to marginalize and oppress and segregate people of color, people from low-income backgrounds, people from different religious backgrounds. And we had bought in hook, line, and sinker early on to the idea that that was okay, that there was a natural order to things. We would often describe it as a natural order to things, and that that meant that segregation should occur. So we never really thought about really how people should be able to get into housing or access housing. And again, this is in land use. There's an entire component of planning that actually does this quite responsibly. But land use planners really, really enjoy trying to just plan for housing units and then saying, cool, my job is done. And that's where you end up with things like these different housing types, right? And so we have housing types that range from detached single family housing to a high rise and everything in between. Well, the boxed part is what we call the missing middle part of housing. And that has recently received a lot of attention in Minneapolis, in the state of Oregon, and in the city of Portland, as now we have eliminated the single family home only zone to create space for all of these middle types of housing to occur. Now, why does this matter in the context of homelessness and planning for housing is that we have created such a dichotomy between single family detached housing and mid-rise housing that we decided that poor people should be in apartments and rich people should be able to access the single detached housing, and everyone would be kept separate, and that's fine. And we didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the access into that housing. We often, as land use planners, will create those housing units and then say, all right, cool, we're done. We counted the number of people we think will be here in 20 years. Sure, there's like some cost to producing housing and making housing happen, but we're not going to worry about that so much. And I think that that is one of the areas where urban planning and land use planning in particular has really dropped the ball, is that we aren't really saying and looking at our zoning codes and thinking about, well, what does it mean to actually create affordability and accessibility into housing units. It's very important that everyone keeps in mind and remembers that our housing market is designed to be a capitalist market focused on wealth generation for people who have means and want to continue to have means. The housing market is never going to produce housing for people who are extremely low income. The sheer amount of money to buy materials and hire laborers is going to make it cost more than $0. And if someone doesn't have any money, then they're not going to be able to access that housing. We also do not live in a country where we have a universal right to housing. And this means that there is nothing that requires us to actually provide housing for people. And so the ways that you might see some mixes happen, and we've deliberately played on some of these stereotypes of housing models, is public housing, the apartment, a public mix of market and public funding, naturally affordable rental housing, and the market housing. And then we have CLTs and co-ops, and then of course the quintessential dream of home ownership and the belief that that is the best way to secure wealth in this country, and that should be the goal for what we go forward with. All right, so one of the things that I'm really trying to work on at the center is making us kind of rethink these more, quote, natural relationships. First, with the idea that our housing typologies should in fact be connected specifically to money, right? So we tend to look at this kind of housing typology metric and say, all right, the high rise is where we're going to have all the public housing, or maybe a mid rise, or maybe a multiplex, but dear God, no, not a townhome or a bungalow court or a courtyard or a duplex, right? This is where we start to get in. This is where people who have money should be able to live and live unencumbered by people who have less money. Um, obviously this will vary depending on where you're living. And of course, if you're living in downtown Portland right now, high rises are very expensive. And so I think that, again, that's what we need to just remember, that none of this and none of the way we have structured our land use system or our access to housing is natural. It is completely constructed by preferences and what we have decided to value. And what we do not value is the ability for people to have free and easy access to housing. So one of the other things that we're trying to really question is why and how we've ended up in a situation where certain services are in fact about um, clicked on the wrong thing. Are really considered standard, right? So if you build housing, you're going to have to put sewer and plumbing in. You're going to have to put in water, electricity, and roads. Now, some places don't require that you plan for schools in that same way, or parks or transit, but a lot of places do. What we're saying is that in addition to sewer to transit, we should also be thinking about infrastructure and access and services as income, case management, healthcare, social support, and community care. Right. And so I've really been thinking about, well, what would it look like if we charge service development fees to actually provide healthcare to people, to make sure that people were getting the healthcare they needed in homes, for people who needed to be able to have case management, that was coming attached to their housing, so that everyone is having the same access to wraparound services rooted within their housing unit. And it's normalized in the way that we think of as sewer and plumbing. The idea then would be that we are thinking about housing typologies, accessibility, services as a way to wrap around the individual. And this idea was inspired, of course, by what we know to be the best way to support people who have been experiencing homelessness in housing is to provide services that they might need so that they're not having to come in and out, that they have a place to live and to be able to be supported. All right, so that's some of the basics. I'm sure it totally felt basic in 101. Actually, a lot of you on this list are, in fact, people I know. So you already know the answers to most of this stuff. All right. What's happening right now? I like to think about, understanding homelessness in April 2021, and understanding homelessness in May 2021 in the Portland community. And as I said at the beginning, we're really struggling with framing these two conversations between how do we actually provide affordable housing and services, and how do we provide compassionate care and support to people who are experiencing homelessness right now. Some of the standard ways that we talk about providing affordable housing is rents to access existing housing, if there is in fact existing housing to access, the production of new housing, protecting naturally occurring affordable housing, investing in services. For instance, we have a significant gap in healthcare providers, mental health care providers in particular. If you've tried to find a psychiatrist or psychologist in this community, you know how hard it is. We also know that while all healthcare is experienced better for people of color when that provider is the same racial background as them, that this is particularly the case for mental health. And we see an especially acute deficit of mental health care providers of color. We also need to be thinking about tenant protections and policy changes for people to access housing. Tenant protections and stopping evictions is probably one of the biggest things that we need to think about and talk about right now. On a previous study that we worked on with Dr. Bates, we saw that the cost to the homelessness system, specifically, if we allow the number of people who are facing eviction to actually be evicted, is truly astronomical. And so if we aren't going to be actually canceling people's rent, then we really need to be thinking about, well, what does that mean for how we're going to actually continue to support people? So all of these things are well and good. One of my favorite questions, and I know Nicole Hayden of the Oregonian um, did an article that was framed loosely around this concept of, where is the affordable housing? Why is it taking so long? And you came here for that answer. I'm not completely sure. We do have a podcast episode coming out that will get into this a little bit with the head of the Housing Authority, Michael Bonacore. But really, it just comes down to our desire and commitment to producing that housing faster. Housing is expensive. Acquiring housing, maintaining housing, protecting housing, all of it costs money. And trying to figure out how we're going to bring all that money together and get that housing to happen faster, I don't know what the holdup is to actually making that happen. Um, on the other side, then we end up focusing instead on having this really, what I think is probably a very wonky conversation about how do we make affordable housing happen faster, very focused on what we're going to do to support people who are unsheltered. And to be clear, I think that this is an incredibly important and moral issue that we are trying to think about. Things like hygiene, waste management, food and water, stable shelter for people who are having to live unsheltered, having a quality range of sheltering choices. We have an opportunity still to purchase motels and allow those to serve as temporary housing for people. California has actually been demonstrating over the last year that motels can play a role in stabilizing people and helping them move into permanent housing. I think that the tougher thing is that a lot of the conversations I end up in terms of policy communities is the focus on quick fixes and cheap solutions. And when we're thinking about how to compassionately support people who are living unsheltered, I don't understand how those go together. And in fact, they don't. Right. So if we are actually being driven by the question of really and truly trying to help people, then we need to start with asking what they need and what they want to survive continuing to live without a house, right? Because when we are not able to produce the affordable housing and services faster, we are actively choosing to allow people to remain homeless. And so, as we are making that choice, then the question is, well, what can we do for you? And that's a really uncomfortable fact to face, right? To really face the fact that, maybe the reasons affordable housing is taking so long, there's actually some really compelling reasons, and that's the way it's going to be. And so, we need to think about compassionate care. Um, but, you know, otherwise, we need to figure out how to make that housing faster while thinking about the compassionate care. And so I think that this is one of the challenges you'll see. I feel like every other week there's a new plan to help people who are unsheltered, which, again, as a reminder, is not actually about solving homelessness. It's about providing compassionate supports for people who are living unsheltered. It is one of the most, if not the most, politically contentious issue in the region, and it's incredibly confusing to try to figure out how to weigh into it. And so when we're done, I'm happy to answer questions about some of that as I understand it. Um, in terms of thinking about what we are doing for response locally, the slides keep freezing when I'm talking. Um, when we think about current local government funds, so a lot of y'all are probably like, hey, like I feel like I voted on a bunch of stuff to to be able to say we're going to produce the affordable housing and to help people move off the streets. And part of what you're seeing is true. Yes, you actually have voted on a significant amount of money. Is that our local governments and our state governments are having to triage a dramatic disinvestment from the federal government in housing and in homeless services. And so, because of that, we're really struggling to identify what the gaps, well, the gaps are many, but which of the gaps do we try to fill and with which funding sources? So there are actually 3 revenue measures if you live in the city of Portland that you are supporting right now. One is the City of Portland Housing Bond and the Metro Regional Government Housing Bond. Those 2 bonds are what we call bricks and sticks, and that means that they go to actual physical goods that are going to be physical housing units that are purchased or constructed. The thing that you voted on most recently, assuming you voted for it, was the Metro Regional Government Supportive Housing Measure. And if you're like, well, what is that? That is these, what we describe as wraparound services, mental health care, rent for places where you can access rent that wouldn't be covered by the by the housing bonds themselves. And so I thought it might be useful because the Multnomah County has actually put out their budget for for the first year of this Metro Supportive Housing funding. The money is going to 3 different counties. This is from Multnomah County for year 1 to give you a sense of what this money actually goes to do. And so right now the proposal is that the bulk of it would go to housing, rent assistance, and kinds of supportive services. So things like case management with a social worker or mental health care providers. Increasing shelter capacity, which we've seen the need for, and some of that includes what we describe as alternative shelter, so tiny pod villages, street outreach and system navigation, so making sure there's more connections with people on the street, really building out the portfolio of culturally specific providers and thinking about their system capacity. One of the big disconnects that has happened and that people are trying to rectify is that a lot of the culturally specific providers had not historically worked within homelessness. And a lot of the homeless service providers had not really done anything that was culturally specific. And so trying to figure out how to build up the capacity of culturally specific providers who wanted to work in homelessness while also holding accountable the white dominant providers who had not been really taking care of racial equity has been an ongoing discussion. And so this investment is saying we really want to invest in culturally specific providers who do want to do homelessness work. Regional coordination is a buzzy thing you'll hear a lot about, and there's money for that, and of course for data reporting and analysis. So, I know this is a kind of a couple of different things teed together, and I'm happy to really talk about any of the things I've talked about today. I really think that, again, this question is that we are in a very messy point in time. And it's not that there is an easy solution or a fast solution in terms of, or answers in terms of what we should do to support people on the street outside of the most obvious of providing hygiene, waste management services, and allowing people to stay where they're at. We're also having to really think about, and I think continuing to push to answer this question of where is the affordable housing, right? So what is the pipeline like? what are the barriers to production? And I don't mean like service development charges. There are a whole other meta level of things that we could get into. And how do we push that conversation forward, particularly in light of the fact that there are people who are suffering and do need help and assistance. All right, I will wrap up there. All right, so this is very strange. I have to actually go through the questions now. Okay, and then there's a whole other thing that's Q&A. Why is it that we only seem to see a billion? Okay, so this is the question. I'm going to read it so that everyone doesn't have to watch me read it. Why is it that we only seem to see Portland Metro County building new affordable housing complexes that have a small number of floors and levels? For example, the newly built Nick Fish complex only has like 3 floors. Why shouldn't we be making the most out of that land by building taller, affordable buildings that can house more people, so forth and so forth? Okay, so I honestly don't know the answer to that question because I've focused more on the larger buildings that have gone in. And so I would have to ask someone specifically about those structures. Um, so yeah, and what the deal with the particular land is. All right, next question. Would love to hear your thoughts on right to counsel for evictions. It seems very popular across the country right now and a straightforward first step to reducing the number of evictions. How would it work in Portland? I don't know how it would work in Portland, but it seems like a pretty basic thing, right? So yes, people should have a right to counsel before they're evicted. The idea that there are people who are able to go in with lawyers, that there's an entire cottage industry of lawyers who do nothing but help apartment buildings evict people, and then the people who are facing eviction do not have that same kind of right or access to counsel is truly horrifying. And I know that people have probably been watching some of the evictions reports that have come out in the last year, and there's a great group, Don't Evict PDX, I think is their Twitter handle. If y'all are here, put it in the chat. Um, that are going down every day to observe, and they tweet out from the courthouse some truly appalling things that tenants are having to go through. Um, Andy Miller is in our chat correcting that the Nick Fish building is 6 stories. I don't actually know what everyone considers high or low or so forth. So we will make sure that we try to find out what the difference is and why certain buildings have gone in at certain heights. Um, Okay, the role of sheltering and providing services to the houseless community is privatized to a constellation of nonprofits, my personal editorial, the nonprofit industrial complex, rather than consolidated under a single public entity. What are some strategies and tools to overcome the silos? Um, uh, Man, Dr. Bates is like on it today with the hilarious comments. So the strategies to overcoming some of the silos is first holding nonprofits accountable. And I think that in particular around racial equity, we have just been ramping up what that even means or looks like. Nonprofits that have historically not served people of color or do not serve them well really need to be held accountable for that work and to be able to improve their practices. I think there are some who have simply not done that work who do actually want to make changes, but also they can't necessarily continue to hold all of the funding. And the other thing is things like the continuum of care, a home for everyone, which is set up and required by HUD for all of the jurisdictions, um, to require more coordination and collaboration. I actually think about this a little differently. So there's the nonprofit industrial complex issues, and then there's the issues of siloing. Um, And I think the siloing issue you can actually get at through the funding requirements, which is of course what's happened with the continuum of care and will continue to happen with the Metro service dollars. The issue of a nonprofit industrial complex versus a single entity or the government being in control of all the money, I think is a different kind of question, right? And so do we want single entities? Is it easier to hold a single entity, be it government or a nonprofit, accountable, or is that giving too much control to one group? And then also, I think the issue of the question of should people who are simply living their lives have access to money that isn't held at all by nonprofits or by government, that it is money that is given to them to live their lives or to organize in ways that would work for and support themselves. Uh, all right, so we got a question about the point in time numbers and how to find numbers. Okay, so the data sources, point in time count, most people know how to find that because that's the only thing anyone seems to care about, and certainly the only thing the reporters and politicians who don't know about homelessness seem to care about. And so that's pretty easy to find on all the government websites, the continuum of care websites. On any continuum of care website, you should also be able to find what is called the AHAR, which is the Annual Homelessness Assessment Report. And that should include the number of people who lived in shelter and that they served across the year. The big numbers that we used in the counts that we did for 2017 is the schools data. Schools are required to report homelessness based on a doubled up definition. Point in time count is not including doubled up. And so that's why that number is smaller. And so the McKinney, those are called the McKinney-Vento Act student schools number. Those are on the state page. So the state of Oregon, if you Google state of Oregon, McKinney-Vento Act, homelessness students and homelessness, you'll pop up an entire spreadsheet for every single district for every year, the number of youth who are enrolled in school who have experienced homelessness. There's also some possible sources from SNAP data, but those tend to be the big data sources. All right, so someone asked me, do you support the initially proposed Multnomah County homelessness budget of 150 million? I have not dug into the budget enough to know if I think there is sufficient allocations in what particular areas. Honestly, like with my position, I sometimes don't know. I know when things aren't getting any money that should, but if it's like, should this get 10 million and this get 15, that starts to get into an area that I am not as well versed in. Racial disparities. This is great. So many great questions. This is awesome. I know it's really boring. Maybe I should bring the baby in and you can look at the baby while I read questions. Racial disparities and give examples of why advocates who want to end homelessness as well as homeless service providers need to see racial equity as part of their work. Okay, so homelessness, from my perspective, is the demonstration of all societal failures in one spot. And so if you look at education, we see massive disparities based on race, graduation rates, over-disciplining of youth of color, particularly boys of color, Black and brown boys. If you look at healthcare outcomes, you'll see disproportionate rates of access to medical care. You'll see lower life expectancies for people of color. If you look at access to housing, if you look at economics and income, all of those things, you see significant racial disparities. That means that, of course, in homelessness, we are going to see a lot of disparities for people of color. I have heard some people who are white say, well, then it's just too overwhelming. We can't work on it because it's from everywhere. I really would prefer it if white people did not say that, because that is not particularly helpful and is actually really offensive. The idea instead is that where can you make differences in how that acutely shows up within homelessness? One of the places that particularly homeless service providers really have to pay attention to is how they are in fact participating in racialized practices, right? So we have seen research that shows that particularly Black men and Black youth experience higher discipline rates in shelter when compared to whites and for the same types of behaviors. And so that is sometimes what we call implicit bias training, but it's also, I think, going further and actually tracking discipline infractions and encounters. One of the studies that we did in the fall with Street Root, Shannon Singleton, and the Joint Office of Homeless Services We asked people, what mattered to them in terms of having their racial identity acknowledged in a positive way. And they had talked about even just having people believe that an encounter was racialized. So if you can imagine, going in to and saying, hey, I felt like this was a racialized experience, and somebody working at a shelter, a case manager is saying, it wasn't, I'm white, I'm not racist, right? And even getting into that right fight is already going to throw off any kind of productive relationship, create a racialized environment, a hostile environment for someone, and tell them that they are not going to be seen as equal or worthy of support in a space. I think the other thing is, if you, again, like going back to the beginning, I was talking about the importance of centering on racial equity. If we focus on racial equity first and foremost, we can make differences in homelessness. If you focus on homelessness and don't think about racial equity, you are never going to solve homelessness. I think about this in the context right now of this mental health care provider shortage that we have. Um, if I'm being told that for some people, mental health support is essential to their desire to stay in housing, and then you tell me that people of color really need to be seeing mental health care providers of color, and then you tell me there aren't mental health care providers of color, then what are we doing to fix that? Because if we don't, we've already created a system that is going to continue to perpetuate disparities. Okay. Biggest challenge in Eugene we hear is that, how do we know that the public is money's being used? And if we do this, won't it attract unhoused people from other areas? So shouldn't this be a statewide effort rather than a regional one? Okay, well, I think everything should be duplicated. I am more than happy to pay a lot more taxes. So yes, do something statewide, do something regional. We have regional needs. Some regions have more wealth. This question of attracting people who are experiencing homelessness, if you go to a space where there are practitioners or scholars who work in homelessness around the country, everyone laughs about the fact that everyone in their communities also say this. So apparently everyone is moving across the country to be in every community in the country because they are attracted to that and want to move their houseless. I think this is a very data-driven question. So if you look at the data of people who are experiencing homelessness in any given jurisdiction, very few of them are moving there houseless. And so I think that in and of itself addresses that issue. There are some important exceptions with some of the subdemographic populations that we look at. And so you might see that, oh, YouTube is working now. Hello, YouTube. So we do see that some transgender or LGBTQIA2S, I think I got the whole acronym, youth are driven out from their families and they have no place to go. And so they do move to the larger urban areas if they're in a rural community to access services. Similarly, some people who are trying to take care of family members with severe mental health issues will also end up basically being dropped off in urban areas because their family can't support them in the community they're living in and don't have the money to set up in one of the larger urban areas. But I don't think that is not a significant portion. How do we know public money is being used well? I mean, that really is right now, I think, a $1 billion question, because people have to agree on what that metric of success is. When we think about the supportive services housing measure, there is actually a debate on what success looks like for that measure. And so some people are out there saying success is measured by fewer people living in downtown on sidewalks. And okay, well, I can do a lot to make that happen that actually maybe isn't actually good practice, but that's a very particular metric of success. For other people, it's knowing that the people who are being served effectively, that fewer people are exiting or returning to homelessness. And so I think that's what you have to do is very carefully define what are the things that tell you success are, and then how do you back up and measure them and demonstrate that you are actually achieving your goal. Um, Toronto, Canada. Private public partnerships for affordable housing. Yeah, I don't study that at all. I just want to build housing. I don't necessarily really care how it gets done. So I'm really annoying in that space. I'm sure there's people on this call or webinar who will be happy to jump in the chat and say that they would love to talk to you more. I just want to make all the housing happen through public financing, and I don't care about making builders actually want to build more housing, although there are a lot of examples of that work. Um, Can you speak a little bit to the significant animosity displayed towards instances of compassionate care, neighbors pushback, da, 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 da. So, I think there's more humanitarian ways and compassionate ways and empathetic ways to think about neighbor response. And I'm running out of them. I think that, we do have some of those basic ideas that people are afraid or unsettled by seeing something that we're not supposed to be seeing happening. And I think it's very upsetting. I think that some people do see people in need and they're overwhelmed by that and they adopted a defensive posture. This is an overwhelming space. I'm asked continually, what can people do to help? And most of the time I'm just like, go pay for more taxes. Go, take a trash bag out and pick up some trash. And that's all you can really do. I mean, as well as advocate and vote for reasonable elected officials. Um, but this isn't a space where we actually can like roll up our sleeves and all get in there. And I think that's hard. Um, I think that, some of this is also typical NIMBY pushback, right? This embedded language of who is deserving of support and care and who is not is very pervasive in homelessness. I gave a lecture, I guess about a year and a half ago, about early origins of zoning codes and the ways in which zoning codes were discussed to segregate and oppress people. And it was language like, people are dirty or diseased, people who are poor, people who are Black, people who are Japanese. And it was this discussed language around them. And I went to a neighborhood, a meeting in St. John's that night, and people were literally using that verbatim language to describe people experiencing homelessness. And I I don't know how we make inroads with people who have othered human beings to that degree. And I don't have a great answer for what you do, but that is kind of what we tend to bring to it, is that there are some very visceral responses as well as some very deep fears about who other people are. The session is being recorded. You can email sknow2 after to get what is going on. Yeah, I got a good question. Does anybody actually want to commit to the money of the study, the study that we estimated, the need for that? No, no one's committed to that money. That would be great. Andy, how do you see housing first, aka unconditional housing, fitting into our solutions? It feels like Portland is behind other places on maximizing this approach to long-term unsheltered homelessness. I'm not going to speak to whether it's behind, but I definitely feel like we are not doing anywhere close to as much as we need to be doing. So the idea is that housing first, people are able to move into their housing regardless of their circumstances. There's no requirements on program participation. They come in, they can leave, they can come and go. They're doing what they need to do to secure housing, and services are offered to them but aren't required. That is the gold standard in terms of the evidence. Is also what, if you talk to people of color, will tell you all the time, right? Like, I got to develop trust with people or an organization. I need to feel like I have autonomy to be able to come and go. The study that we did in the fall, the survey we did in the fall, reading the responses that people really like when they were imagining living in housing, one of their greatest concerns was not being able to have their friends and family come visit whenever they wanted. was one of their top stressors about moving into housing. And so trying to even just imagine that. Any updates on the potential to defund the police in order to refund social services? I have no idea. I don't know where that's at. What defines or counts as housing? Different forms cost quite different amounts, so it affects how much we can build. I don't actually think that's true. I think we decide what we want to fund, and we often, I feel like we're constantly at a race to the bottom to build the least amount of things with the least amount of money to do the least amount possible. And so, my question is actually, what kind of housing do you want to live in? And what does it take to provide that, within some reason. I really am never going to support everyone getting a McMansion, but I think this should be about understanding what people need and want to be able to live and love and thrive in their housing. What are your feelings on the price tags of some of the new public housing dollars? Yeah, I'm not a housing finance person. That's Matthew Gephardt. I am happy to relay your question to Matthew Gephardt. I think that the upshot is that it's expensive. Housing is expensive. All of these things are expensive. Paying mental health care workers is expensive. And I don't know how we not have it be expensive, right? So I know we don't want it to be unethical. I know we don't want it to just, go to wait, there shouldn't be government waste on money, but things cost money. And um, I think, again, my question is, what will help a person feel better? I think this is a question that gets brought up a lot with these conversations about single resident occupancy, SROs. Um, you know, Technically you can house a lot more people with SROs, but you aren't necessarily going to be providing housing that works for them and is good for them. Housing first works. Yes. Oh, yes. Someone was also at that St. John's meeting. Yes. Um, Number one request I hear: people in a safe place that can create community and access hygiene. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's how we decide how to do this work, I think is an open question, right? So should we be trying to create enough spaces that can be the basic needs for as many people as possible as part of a harm reduction strategy? I don't know, this become like a lot of words of like that get very buzzy and that are also like very politically laden on like whoever's plan someone is trying to do. So I want to be really careful about saying, yes, I love this idea, um, because of these particular politics. I think that we do need to have conversations focused on particular areas where people are living and ask them, what do they need and want to feel supported at this moment? And yes, it is hygiene and waste management to start, right? But then what else can we be doing? What does it look like to build community? And how do we actually go about that work? Todd Ferry and Martha Pitini, and who work with HAC and are part of the Center for Public Interest Design, have done a lot of this kind of work with the tiny pod villages. And so I don't know if it's a question of harm reduction or basic needs or enough spaces or size of spaces. I think that, again, it's asking people, what are the things that could actually work for them? Lots more questions. Oh yes, people living on campus. Yeah. I've sent a lot of ideas on how PSU could address homelessness on campus, both for students and staff, but also people who were just living on the campus who were not affiliated or adjacent to. I'd be happy to share the memo of ideas that I sent. I don't know where they're at this point in time. The last time I was able to check in with someone was pre-COVID, and it did, I don't actually know of that many reports of property being damaged by people experiencing homelessness, which is what this message is saying. And creating an environment in which PSU community members feel safe is a whole different question, because safety is relative, and what makes one set of people feel safe is not what makes other people feel safe. Oh my God, y'all, so many good questions. I'm happy to keep hanging out. Oh, there's other questions over here. Okay. Is tax crediting really good public policy? Lord, y'all in these finance questions. If Lisa Bates is here, answer this question in the chat. I actually, everything is good, everything is bad, right? That's kind of the thing about policy. I think that, the more things that we talk about, like even just the question of do we invest in housing vouchers, right? We are investing more in the capitalist framework around housing, right? When we are making developers have more money. And that is what housing developer can do, right? So it's not necessarily going to nonprofits. Vouchers are also going to people who are making real money off of their properties. And so that's a choice, right? And so I think these questions are always, which values do we want to embrace the most? And that's kind of how I would put that question. Can you put this? Oh, the data types. Okay, so I'm going to type something. Okay, so point in time, I got a question about data. I'm going to try to answer this next question. Why are we not providing the basic needs Sean mentioned for all? That's a question for the mayor and the county commissioner and the president of Metro, as well as all the elected officials on those groups, because I don't know. I don't know what they're doing, why, or how, and the choices that they're making. I will say again, I have been in a lot of policy conversations that people do tend to focus on. A lot of these are public meetings, even trying to spend the least amount of possible to serve the most number of people. And I think the reality, annual homelessness, the reality is that tents are like houses, cars are like houses, and that they're producing waste. People who are living in them are producing waste in the same way that I do in my house. But I have pipes in my house. I have a garbage truck that comes to my house. And so I think that that is one of the things that we need to really be thinking about is, are we looking at a situation where we need to be providing services to, tents and cars in the same ways that we do to students? Oh yes, Dr. Bates has weighed in on the light tech question. All right, point in time count. That's hilarious. I'm just trying to make sure I've gotten all these. I'll hop over to the chat. All right. Okay, so going over to the Q&A, which was where I was supposed to be reading things. All right, we'll come back to the zoning question in a minute. We talked a little bit about NIMBYs and the role they play in derailing interventions. Yeah, they play a lot of roles in derailing things. And the only thing I can tell you, it's like what we talk about in racial equity when we say we need white allies, we need housed allies to go and get their friends and their neighbors, and to understand that, one of the talking points I have found helpful, at least at shutting down a conversation, it's not necessarily a way that makes people change their mind, is that people who are housed are also suffering from mental health issues or living with mental health issues. There are people who are housed who are convicted felons. There are people who are housed who are committing crimes every day, sometimes in their own homes. And those are usually the things in which neighbors try to rally around and organize around. The pedophilia argument is in particularly gross and heinous. And so I think that it's really trying to help people think about, people who are housed have the privilege of having to deal with their issues in private, and people who are experiencing homelessness aren't. Eugene. Yeah, where are the through lines for collaboration to services? How can we find ways to provide these services to be more collaboratively and more efficient together? Yeah, it's a bad day to ask me that question. I am not feeling, despite being a collaborative planning scholar, I am not feeling the collaborative spirit. I am really thinking about needing for accountability and holding people accountable for what they are claiming they're going to do. Um, and what they're claiming they're going to do and what they're actually doing. And I think that's an okay thing. I think in Portland we spend a lot of time trying not to be what people would describe as confrontational, and I think of as accountable. And so, really, where are you trying to make your impact? I get it. Everyone wants to be collaborative, but some people aren't getting their jobs done, and so we have to figure out why that is, and to how to build them up effectively. Um, Presentation has been recorded. Are there sufficient local jobs available? No, there are not sufficient local jobs, especially right now in the middle of the pandemic. I think that the other thing too is there's a fallacy around the job idea. Um, Minimum wage job is not going to support you to live in housing, right? And so people who want to work should be able to access jobs and should be able to build wealth in that way. But I actually very much am a housing person, solves homelessness. And I think I really angered a lot of people early on in A Home for Everyone, because I was like, we don't even talk about job training, just make the housing happen. Um, but in part, that is because in order to actually be able to live in housing in Portland, you would need to make such a high level of income. Um, and that makes it hard for housing. Income can help you stay in housing or contribute to your housing and rent, but you're not going to get there completely. Um, so someone asked about, is this a student trying to get me to write their paper for them right now? I am writing a paper, and I was wondering if you have any current stats on what the percentage of people who are homeless are who are arrested. Yeah, so, oh, Stephanie's going to answer this question live. Yes, I can drink some water. I guess Stephanie meant live as in type into it. So we'll see. Um, okay, could you say more where non-housing assistance to people who are unsheltered can contribute to long-term housing once it's available? Yeah, so I think that, I mean, to me, it's, and again, I'm very focused on the mental health issue right now because I feel like it's not getting lifted up in the ways that I think are important. Um, but I think that what you really want to be thinking about is having the supports that people are receiving outside be tied directly to the people who will be helping them as they move into housing if they want to, right? So much of this work is based on trust and relationships. And the people I talk to who have moved from being houseless to being in housing, listening to them talk about that person who kept showing up for them is, it's just so powerful. And to know that you've got, a mental health worker coming out to see you, a physician coming out to see you, a case manager coming out to see you, and that these are going to be the people who continue to see you no matter where you end up in housing. I think that is where some of our greatest opportunities are to begin serving people while they have to wait outside for housing to happen. Are community land trusts a viable option approach? Yes, community land trusts are awesome. Love them. Autonomous villages, I don't know what you mean by viable. So I think I need to understand a little bit more about what viable means. How are we applying resources to um, other groups that are, yeah, veterans, deaf and hard of hearing, women, particularly those with various level of trauma and those with other visibility? Um, the supportive housing services measure will be prioritizing anyone with health-related issues, disabilities, and there's going to be a less, I don't want to use the word rigorous, maybe cumbersome, a less cumbersome definition to have to deal with in terms of being able to qualify people for services that you might normally have to do for HUD. All right. Yes, the battle of the light tech is going on. I love it. All right, I think that's close to everything. I may have missed something. If I did, feel free to shoot me an email and I'll do what I can to answer it. Oh, there was a nerdy zoning question earlier. I mean, I loved it, right? But you know, other people get really bored with zoning. How and who should distinguish between exclusionary zoning, i.e. codes making housing exclusive and unaffordable, versus housing rights definitions and standards, e.g. to have the same well, how we make those determinations, well, how do we distinguish between, I don't think I fully understand the question, because how do you distinguish between exclusionary zoning versus housing rights? I'm not sure that I know what that means, but I know who sent this question because they sent it to me on Twitter, so I can follow up on the Twitter. Yes. All right. No, I don't know anything about Measure 110 at this moment. Oh my goodness, this is a long one that just appeared. We talk about the types of housing you would want to live in. Is the folks we are trying to provide housing for? Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is again the challenge, right? Like, we all talk to a certain set of people. You know, so I've spent a lot more time talking to people who would love to live in a tiny home village. And yeah, well, tiny house villages, I think, do qualify as housing. It's the tiny pod villages that would not qualify as housing. I'm pretty sure tiny houses do qualify as housing per the city code. What I want is to provide the options to people. And so my concern is always that when we expand housing types without actually making sure that people understand their range of choices and that we're actually providing the choices that would help them, that is where I start to get concerned. And that we are setting up mechanisms and ways for local government and for housing providers to provide really cheap things to everyone. And so what was an interest and a desire and preference for 100 people and was adamantly not an interest or preference for, you know, 700 people becomes the only option that all 800 people have because of the way that the way the politicians and people who want to actually spend money on things happen. Um, I'm asking my husband to bring the baby up. So yeah, I think it is this kind of like give and take, right? And I think that we do also have to recognize that a lot of the people who are getting their voices heard, um, who are experiencing homelessness, who end up being able to be supported in these policy conversations are not in fact representative of everyone experiencing homelessness. And so I think that this is tricky, right? And so I think for me, and I know part of these questions are coming from my comments around shelter to housing continuum. I think that, you know, part of this is where you have the conversations, right? And so having a robust question of what does it look like for us to provide a full range of housing types that fulfill the needs of different people is very different than saying we're just going to have these other housing types and not thinking about the unintended consequences. And so I want to be able to live how they feel like they need to live. You know, I think that there is, you know, it's also, I think, understanding why people have the preferences they do, right? So I have talked to people who have said, I'd rather live in a tiny pod forever than ever live in an apartment again because my apartment was terrible. And, you know, the property manager was terrible. It was run down. You know, my neighbors were awful, right? And so again, I get that, right? And if the reality is we can't provide um, multi-unit apartment buildings that are quality places to live, then maybe that's the option. But also, would someone prefer a tiny pod or a 2-bedroom home, right? And so I don't see why we can't provide them the 2-bedroom home. And instead we're saying the only other choice is the pods, right? So this is also how we kind of set up choices and options. Yay, Danny asked this question, yes. Yeah, so I think, for me, this is one of the most complicated conversations, because again, it's, I want people, if somebody comes to me and says, I would like an 800, 900 square foot 2-bedroom house, 1,000 square foot 2-bedroom house, I don't see why they don't get to have that when I do, simply because of money. And so, if the options that I'm presenting to someone is a pod, a tiny house on wheels, or an apartment, then that's a very different set of choices. And so I think that sometimes we're all building to different things. I don't know, this has gotten real wandery. All right, I think the baby's asleep, so anyone who is holding out hope to see the baby may be out of luck. And I think that's it. Thank y'all for coming.